He describes at various times his time out in the pasture with the sheep. Then he's invited at some point to play his instrument for King Saul. Then, of course, he falls out of favor with Saul, and Saul becomes angry with him and wants to kill him, and he's on the run. And he has no home. He can't go back home. He flees away to the Philistine area, and they don't want him there, and he comes back. He lives for a little while in a cave, and that's the setting of our psalm tonight. From there, he would eventually become king and dwell in the palace. And from there, his own son would rebel against him, and he would go on the run again as an older man, running away from his own son who led a rebellion against him. So whether it's, at times being out in the pasture, to living on the run in a cave, to being king and in a palace, to being on the run again, his storyline it goes from the highest of the highs to the lowest of the lows. And I think most of us, our life is a lot more steady than that, than David's life. But he experienced this huge range of circumstances. And in our psalm tonight, he's in a cave, and he's crying out to God from this cave. And that's what Psalm 142 records, is his prayer to God from the cave. This is probably referring to the event that's recorded in 1 Samuel 22. If you want to hold your place there at Psalm 142 and just look at the first two verses of that passage, 1 Samuel 22. We're going to begin and end on this passage, 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. Right before this is when he learned he had to run away because King Saul was seeking his life. So, verse 1, David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down to him. And everyone who is in distress, and everyone who is in debt, and everyone who is bitter in soul gathered to him. He became a commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. There was another event a couple of chapters later where he's hiding in a cave and Saul's chasing him. You might remember, and he cut off a piece of his robe. So there was more than one time when David was in a cave, and I don't know for sure exactly which one this psalm is based on, but it's likely, I would say, that it was this occasion that's recorded here. So with that in mind, we'll circle back to that at the end. I want to make an application out of that, what's recorded there. But let's go back now to the psalm itself, and we'll just kind of walk through it. The first thing that he says is, verses 1 and 2, with my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. I mentioned this a long time ago at the introduction to this whole series on the Psalms, but in one of the features of Hebrew poetry is a parallelism. In our language, when you write a poem, not always, but often, there is a rhyming scheme. And the rhyming scheme is that the last word of each phrase, or maybe every other line, or there's some scheme where it ends on a similar sound. Phonetically, there's a repetition. Car with jar or something like that. There's some kind of sound that repeats. Well, in the Hebrew poetry, there's no rhyme scheme. And I asked somebody one time, because I wondered if that was just because it's been translated. And so I asked somebody one time that would know. I said, if you could read it in Hebrew, does it have a rhyming scheme to it like we think of poetry? And he said, no, it doesn't. But what it does have is a rhyming scheme of thoughts. The ideas repeat. So it's not the sound of a word that repeats, but it's the repetition of an idea. And so you see that it opens up with two of these couplets. With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. That's saying the same thing, just slightly different way. Same thing in verse 2. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Those two lines are saying the same thought, just slightly different words. So the thought that's being expressed rhymes in a way that it's a repetition. And usually, in the way that they do this artfully, is that the thought is developed as it goes. So it starts out with my voice I cry out to the Lord. Well, what kind of a cry is it? Well, as you follow this, he pleads for mercy. And he pours out his complaint, and he tells his troubles. So even though it's really four ways of saying the same thing, each one develops the idea a little bit more and kind of, reveals more information about what it is that he's saying. And I wanted to pick out one particular phrase from this that really kind of caught my attention as I was studying at this time, and that is, I pour out my complaint to God. So when David is in great distress, he pours out his complaint. But that's an interesting word picture. That's another feature of Hebrew poetry, is that it uses a lot of word pictures. For example, the most famous one is, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside the still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Well, David could have just said, God takes care of me and provides for me. But he says it in a way that paints a word picture. And in this case, the idea is also a word picture of pouring out a complaint. So I looked at other examples of this same phrase that's used, and I'll share some with you. In an earlier psalm, also a psalm of David, I believe, Psalm 42, my tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I would go with the throng and lead them in the procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise and multitude keeping festival. He remembers those things while he's pouring out his soul. A beautiful example, but a heartbreaking one, comes from the book of Lamentations. Arise, cry out in the night. At the beginning of the night watches, pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift up your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Of course, Lamentations comes after the destruction of Jerusalem. And the call there is to pour out your heart like water. Looking at this idea of pouring out, it's used in other ways besides a cry to God for mercy. For example, God is said to pour out his wrath in several passages. We could look at lots of those, but Psalm 69 verse 24 says, pour out your indignation upon them, let your burning anger overtake them. So in that case, God is said to pour out his wrath upon the wicked. Or actually, the psalmist is calling for God to do that. Another example that's in a completely different kind of way, in Psalm 94, he says, O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? They pour out their arrogant words, all the evildoers boast. So the wicked pour out arrogant words, and Proverbs 15 says, the tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouth of fools pour out folly. So, taking all this together, it seems that the idea of pouring out is to just let something go without holding back. So think about how that fits all these. When God is said to pour out his indignation, it's to basically just let loose, to just dump wrath on them. Just let it all go, like burn them up. The wicked pour out arrogant words. In other words, they don't exercise any restraint. They're not trying to choose carefully what they say. They just, this terrible stuff comes out. The same thing with fools. They just pour out folly. They don't stop and think about what they're saying. They just pour it out. Now, if you apply that to David's statement here and the others like it, where you pour out your complaint or you pour out your heart, it seems to be the idea, at least the picture that's coming to me, is of just letting everything out. Like all of this pain and suffering and fear, whatever it is that's wrong, just going to God and just pouring it out. Just letting it all come out, saying everything that's on your heart without holding back. So when you think of it, that could be a bad thing, as in these cases, or it could be a good thing, as when we go to God and we just let it all come out and pour out your complaint. And so I wanted to just kind of share those verses with you, as I think it helps kind of bring that expression to light. Then he continues, what is it that he's complaining about? Well, as we continue verse 3 and 4, he describes his circumstance there. He says, when my spirit faints within me, you know the way, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. So first of all, he says his spirit faints within him. You might think of David as being one of those kind of people who never has a down day, but that wouldn't be true. If you read the Psalms, you know that David had a lot of terrible days. And he even experienced times when he says his spirit fainted within him. His spirit felt weak, like from exhaustion. There's other Psalms where he expresses a similar idea. In Psalm 69, he said, "Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you, and my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." So it's interesting to think about David expressing this, that he felt weak in his spirit. He felt faint in his heart at times, and his spirit was fainting within him. And he says that he knows there's a trap hidden for me. He says at the end of verse 3 there, "In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me." Imagine the frustration of that thought that somewhere up ahead they're lying in wait. They've hidden some trap to try to catch me. He also says that he feels alone. Verse 4, "Look to the right and see, there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul." Oh, that's a heartbreaking expression. I think a lot of times when people feel despair, a big part of that is they feel isolated. They feel alone. They feel like they don't have anyone beside them. He says, "Look to my right." You know, a lot of times your right-hand man or your right-hand person, the person who's there at your right side is the one who's kind of like your support, your strength, the one who's seeing you through. And David says, look, there's no one there. There's no one who even notices. No one even seems to care. I don't know if this is all actually true, if there was nobody that cared about David, but this is how he feels. You know, he feels like nobody cares what's happening to me. Look around, nobody's worried about me. And he feels like he has nowhere to go. No refuge remains to me. There's nowhere to get out of this storm. There's nowhere to get away from the danger. There's nowhere to go to be safe. And no one cares for my soul. That's awful. Except one. And the center verse of this is, I'm sure, verse 5, where he says, "I cry to you, O Lord. You are my refuge and my portion in the land of the living." I'll use that picture in just a minute. Verse 5, "I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." Another thing about Hebrew poetry is that very often it builds up to a central verse. There's a parallelism in the overall structure of the psalm. So not only in these couplets, these parallel lines that we've seen, but also there's very often a parallelism to the whole thing. It has a symmetry where it builds up. And I suspect that's going on here as well, because this verse number 5 is this triumphant statement of faith. After such a dark beginning that David is feeling, he's crying out, he's pouring out his heart. He feels alone, he feels weak, he feels abandoned, he has no one beside him. But then he comes to this statement, "I'm crying to you because you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." The portion there is an interesting word. I thought, I wonder what that is about. And what I found out is that how it's often used is someone's portion was like their part in an inheritance, for example. It could be used in a lot of different ways, but the primary way it seemed to be used was if you had a portion, that was your allotment. Now, that was a big deal to the Jews because they had, when they conquered the land, remember the land was divided up and the families and people were given an allotment. They were given a portion, a parcel. There was a part that belonged to them. And so if you had land, if you had a portion, that would give you a place that belonged to you that was a source of security. That would be where you could farm, you could build your house, you were safe there. You're kind of, as we say when you're little kids, I'm on home base, right? So you run around, you're in danger until you can, I'm on home base. And now you're like safe, right? Nobody can get you, nobody can touch you because you're at home base. And, you know, if you had a portion, you had a home base to go to. And David is saying here He's crying to the Lord because he had no refuge, nowhere to turn, but the Lord is his portion. The Lord is his refuge. The Lord is where he finds his safety and security, his home base, so to speak. Next, he admits something that's kind of surprising for such a bold warrior. Verse 6, he says, "Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me." David, I think David is such a fascinating character and character study. You know, the one who would say to his brothers, "What's wrong with you guys? You know, why didn't somebody stand up to this giant? Why are you letting him talk that way?" And he goes running after him, you know. But that same David is saying here, the army, my enemies are too powerful for me. And I think because even when David was young and he ran after Goliath, he recognized the strength wasn't in himself, that the victory belonged to the Lord. The battle belonged to the Lord. And that's what's good to realize about David is he was a powerful warrior. They sang songs about him, remember? Saul's killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. But David never was cocky, the best I can tell. It wasn't about because he was such a mighty, powerful guy. It was when he was victorious, it was because he knew that God was working with him and through him, and he was on God's side. And as long as that was the case, no one could defeat him. But as an individual, he recognized that there were foes and forces that were too strong for him. And that would take a lot of humility, especially if you think about, I think at this point he's probably not king yet. But for anyone, especially a warrior, to say that the enemy is, what I'm up against is too powerful, I need help. I think a lot of times people are very hesitant to admit this. We want to give everyone, including ourselves, the impression that I've got this under control. Yeah, it's hard, but it's not too hard. It's scary, but I got it. It's hard, but I can handle it. I got it. You need help? Nope. You good? I'm good, right? And maybe we're trying to convince ourselves. Maybe we're just trying to convince everybody around us. There's nothing out there too big for me. I've got it under control. But David says, there's too much. It's too dangerous. They're too powerful. And it takes a lot of, I don't know if strength's the right word. It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of honesty to say, I need help. But David is not only crying out to God and saying, what I'm up against is too much for me and I need your help, but he's also writing it down. And I'm sure he knew this would be shared by others, shared with others, seen by others. He's not afraid to pour all this out. Not only is he pouring out his heart to the Lord, but he pours out his heart in this psalm that would be read by others. And even though he was looked to as a leader, he wasn't afraid to let people know when he felt overwhelmed or he felt faint or he felt overpowered even. That he needed assistance, that he needed help. And I don't know why it's so hard for most of us to voice that, but I think that it is. I think it's really hard for most of us to ever admit, I need help. I feel outmatched. I feel exhausted. I feel weak. I feel like, what I'm up against is too much and I need assistance. I sense that we all struggle to actually verbalize that to anybody else. And instead, we want to make sure that everybody thinks that we're good. But David is not afraid to pour this out in his prayer and to pour it out in this psalm that would be visible to all. It ends on a statement of hope. First, a plea, and then a statement of hope. And this is where I meant for this next picture. Come in. He says in verse 7, bring me out of prison that I may give thanks to your name. And then he says, the righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. Bring me out of prison. David, obviously, in his circumstance, felt trapped. He felt confined, and he wanted to be set free. And the good news is God is in the freedom business. Look with me to Psalm 107. I want to read a section of Psalm 107 that I think fits well with this. Psalm 107, we'll read verses 10 through 16. This is talking about various ways that God had saved his people. In verse 10, some sat in darkness in the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and irons. For they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. So he bowed their hearts down with hard labor. They fell down with none to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness in the shadow of death and burst their bonds apart. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. For he shatters the doors of bronze and cuts into the bars of iron. Prisons come in many forms. Some prison is punishment. In this case, Psalm 107, they found themselves in prison because they had rejected God, and then they cried to help, and God set them free. Some prison is a punishment for choices that we made. There's imprisonment that is persecution. David wasn't being punished in this cave. He was being chased by Saul. And many godly people throughout history have found themselves at, like Libya that we read about this morning, in prison simply because they did the right thing. There's those kinds of prisons. There are prisons of addiction. Sin will imprison people. It'll wrap its tentacles around us, and people become trapped, imprisoned by sin. There's mental prisons where people are confined and trapped by things that they struggle with that seem to have a hold over them as well. I believe that God is powerful enough to handle all of these kinds of prisons, that we should turn to him and cry to him as David did and say, set me free. Help me to be free from this prison that I am in. And I think we can pray David's prayer in that regard as well. And then he ends with this statement, the righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. Even though he feels alone, he said a moment ago, earlier, if you look around, there's nobody here, nobody cares. But he states this, that the righteous will surround him. So he looks, I believe, forward to a time when he is not alone, when he is surrounded by the righteous. And I think we can all face that as well and realize when we find ourselves in a cave like David, that it's a temporary thing, that we will again be surrounded with the righteous, and ultimately, of course, we will be surrounded forever with the righteous if we hold on to our faith and we are true to God and stay faithful to him, as David is saying here. And so as we consider some applications of this, let's go back to 1 Samuel 22 again. I said I wanted to start and end at this passage. I think, David's writing this from the cave. If you're wondering where I got that, that's the little heading at the top of the psalm in your Bible. It probably says there from the cave in our psalm. The circumstance was that David was running away from Saul, who was trying to kill him, and so he ran off to a cave, is what it seems like. Now, how often is that exact same thing going to happen to you and me? Probably not. I doubt any of us are ever, who knows, right? But probably not going to find yourself in a cave somewhere, somebody's chasing you down trying to kill you. But notice that David is joined in this cave by a lot of people who have other problems in their lives. In verse 2 of 1 Samuel 22, everyone who is in distress, everyone who is in debt, everyone who is bitter in soul, gathered to him, and he became commander over them. He becomes the leader of this. How would you describe this group of people? But they all find themselves there, I think, in the cave with David. But different things brought them to the cave, different problems. David, they weren't all being chased by Saul. They had other problems. But their problems united them in a sense, I think. I think they saw in David something they could rally behind and get behind. But they had their own kind of problems that brought them to the cave themselves. And so I think in life, there's a number of things that you could wake up one day and you're in the cave. Like, how did you get here in the cave? Well, it could be all kinds of things that could bring you to the cave. Whatever the case may be, what do you do when you find yourself in the cave? What do you do when you look around and there's no one there supporting you? You feel kind of like abandoned. You feel alone. When you feel faint in your spirit, you feel exhausted. What's a child of God to do? Well, if we can follow David's example in this psalm, it begins with pouring out your heart in prayer. Pouring out your heart in the same way that we have seen where you just don't hold back, but to share all of your heartaches and concerns with God. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplications, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, who passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. We have an example of Jesus himself doing that all night long in tears that were like blood, praying and pouring out his heart to his Father. And we should do that as well. Seek refuge in the Lord as David did, trusting in his mercy and care. Admit your need for help. Admit that you don't have it under control. You know, when people have to face an addiction, a prison of addiction, one of the first steps, if you go through the whole 12-step thing, is recognizing that something's got a hold of me and it's more powerful than I am, that I'm not in control, that this has gotten out of hand, because there's a lie that people often tell themselves: I'm in control. I'm doing just fine. I don't need any help. And nothing's going to get better until they recognize, okay, fine, it's not under my control. I'm not okay. I need help. And in any number of cases, whether it's sin or other things, it's important to recognize that there are things we're up against that are too powerful for us, and we need assistance. We need to reach out to God for that, and we can hopefully reach out to each other for that help as well. Seek freedom and cling to hope. David ends this on the note, the idea that I will be surrounded by the righteous. And when you think about it, even when you find yourself in that cave of, at some point in your life, and you're in the cave, if you can just remember that this is temporary, and that one day you won't be in the cave anymore, and you'll be surrounded by righteous people. And one day we'll be surrounded by faithful people praising God in light, not in a cave, but in an eternal day. What an awesome thing. And we just have to, our story is like this too, maybe not to the highs and lows of David's, but we're going to have those good days and bad days. And you may go through that period where you feel like you're in the cave, and yet it's going to pass. And you'll come through that if you'll hold on to your faith. And we can trust that too, one day we will be surrounded by the righteous. And what a wonderful note to kind of end on. If there's anyone here tonight who needs to make something right in your life, I hope that you've been encouraged to make the resolve to do that. If there's any way that we can help, let us know as we stand and sing.
Knowing not it was for me, he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary.